Hi everyone, Kirsten here. So today I thought I would be doing another tag video. This tag video in particular is kind of similar to the horror movie tag, but it has shorter questions for one thing, and some of the questions in there are a slight bit different compared to the previous horror tag. I randomly discovered this tag, I think a few years back, and I am actually gonna try to attempt to make this type of vlog again. This tag video in particular is called That Horror tag. It feels so weird saying that for me for some weird reason, because whenever I try to say the word horror, it almost sounds like I'm saying whore for some weird reason when I'm actually saying horror. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Some days when I pronounce that word, it just sounds really strange for some weird reason. I don't know why. But anyway, with all that rambling being said, I just thought I would kind of go ahead and dive right on into the questions. Okay, so question number 1. What is the first horror movie you remember watching? To be honest, I'm not really quite sure, because when I remember growing up, I've watched quite a few horror films when I was very little. I've pretty much already explained this in my Intro to Sinful Sundays video. So instead of naming off my first horror movie that I remember watching, I just figured I'd kind of explain about horror films that I watched growing up as a child, even though I explained this in one of my previous videos before. But anyway, so to name off a few, I remember I would watch movies like Jaws, Evil Dead 2, Tales from the Crypt, which is more like a TV series, kind of like a horror TV series. And I remember watching oh, what's that one movie? The Fly, which kind of grossed me the fuck out, and it still grosses me out to this very day, especially when that woman was giving birth to that giant maggot. Oh my goodness. It's very sickening for me. And I also remember watching Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So yeah, those are the lists in particular that I remember watching as a child. Very graphic movies at that age to be watching horror films, that's for sure. Okay, so question number 2. What is your favorite horror movie? My favorite horror movie. I definitely have quite a list of favorite horror movies that I like, but to name one in specific, I really like Bram Stoker's Dracula, and that definitely became one of my first favorite vampire movies ever. Like, it still remains my favorite vampire movie till this very day. Stephen Hopkins plays in that movie, and then there's Winona Ryder that plays in it. It's a very, very good movie. It's something I like in horror films, definitely. So despite the fact that there's like gore and violence that are being portrayed in horror films, I also like the fact that there's a little bit of gothic romance being interpreted in that film, which between horror and romance films I kind of like most definitely. So I think the horror romance thing is definitely a great combination for me for some weird reason. But definitely Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then and then I also like The Descent. Question number 3. What is your favorite horror movie genre? To be honest, I don't have a specific favorite horror movie genre, but if I had to name a horror genre in particular that I'm thinking of, definitely along the lines of like psychological haunting, based on a true story type of movies, horror films. Definitely I like that type of genre in Pacific. So yeah, just psychologically haunting stuff is definitely up my alley with horror films. Question number 4. What horror movie genre scares you the most? The The horror genre that really scares me the most is definitely stuff that's based on a true story. So, to give an example, a movie like Wolf Creek, for instance. It was mostly inspired by a true story, but I don't think it was based on a true story from what I've researched and looked up. If you want me to explain that in my Sinful Sundays episode one of these days, I would most gladly like to talk about it in one of my previous episodes. So if you would love to hear about that story, please do leave it in the comments down below. But basically, it's taken place in like Australia or some shit, like in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Australia. And basically there's like this guy that like picks up people, right? And he basically tortures and kills people out of his own entertainment and his sick pleasure. So just stuff like that is definitely very creepy. Mostly serial killer type of movies that are based on a true story scares the shit out of me a little bit, because I could definitely relate to like real life situations that are a lot more scarier than like traditional fictional horror films. Now, don't get me wrong, fictional horror stuff is pretty scary, but mostly like real life events are the ones that definitely scares the shit out of me the absolute most. Especially with like serial killers like Albert Fish or like Richard Speck. Just those type of examples. Definitely creepy as fuck, I'm not gonna lie. Question number 5. What is the last horror movie that actually scared you? Oh my goodness, I can think of one already. So basically the last movie that, it didn't scare me, but it creeped me the fuck out. But basically, like, there's this like horror series, right? It's called I Spit on Your Grave. The first one was okay, but the second one, oh my goodness. To be honest, the second one really did make my stomach turn a little bit, especially with like the first rape scene in that movie. Just rape scenes in horror films generally just always makes my stomach turn a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some rape scenes that just don't creep me the fuck out for some weird reason, but I think depending on how the actor or actress is being portrayed in that type of movie, sometimes it can really send shivers down my spine. So like the way she was like screaming and crying at the top of her lungs while she had some of her clothes torn off and stuff, and the way he was about ready to rape her and stuff. Just stuff like that just made my stomach turn, I'm not gonna lie. Just certain types of rape scenes make my stomach turn, and I could definitely relate to some of the scenes in particular because I was almost a rape victim myself. I never was raped, but I was in a situation where I was almost in that position. So I think that's part of the reason why I get creeped out by horror films that portrays that type of sexual violence. Till that very day, you know, I just don't feel comfortable watching certain rape scenes generally. I just don't feel comfortable with those scenes. That's the only thing in horror films I don't like. Question number 6. Who is your ultimate scream queen, past and present? To be honest, I've already explained this in my horror movie tag, but basically I don't have a favorite scream queen, but if I had to pick one in Pacific, Catherine Isabel is definitely it. So that's all I can say in that department is just Catherine Isabel. I've already explained this in my other tag video about this, but yeah, she's just a badass. And I just think like the horror creepiness factored in American Mary that she played in was definitely awesome. Question number 7. What is a concept that you would like to see in horror? To be honest, the concept that I would really love to see in horror films, and I'm actually surprised that a majority of horror films don't actually portray this type of concept, but basically, to give an example, I would really love to see a concept in horror films of really getting to know like the characters first before going into like the graphic, brutal scenes of like killing somebody or taunting them or whatever case scenario in horror films. I think getting to know like main characters or like the victims in the film is an aspect I would really love to see in horror films. You don't get to see that very often in horror films generally, but to give an example, a movie like The Descent or American Mary or possibly like the remake of Rob Zombie's Halloween, those type of horror movies generally are a good example of that, is like getting to know the characters before going into the graphic, brutal scenes and stuff. Which I think is a very awesome aspect in horror films, to be honest, because if you get to know the victims a little bit more, sometimes you'll feel even more bad for them or feel even more creeped out about those type of scenes generally. That's just my opinion, but that's an aspect I'd love to see more and more into future horror films. But also better story development, because I feel like horror films nowadays are too focused on like, you know, the graphic violence, the creepiness factor in these films, and they focus too much of the gore and the violence that they kind of like forget about like proper story development. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like this generation is too focused on that type of aspect in horror films. Like, they're too focused on the graphic violence and the creepiness factor, but yet they're not focused on like having really good story development. So I hope I'm making sense in that department. So between being attached to the characters and like story development is just two things generally, or just something I've given some pretty thoughts that I would love to see developed in horror films. Okay, so question number 8. What is your favorite on-screen kill? To be honest, I don't have a favorite on-screen like brutal scene kill. I know that I have a few favorite torture scenes, but I honestly don't have a favorite. But if I had to choose one, I like the concept of like the ending to like Freddy versus Jason. Like, for instance, basically like towards the end, I'm gonna be spoiling the scene if you haven't seen it already, but basically there is like this scene where like, you know, Freddy Krueger's replica arm was like torn off or something, and you would randomly think that it would be like Jason walking up to these two couples to like slaughter them or some shit, but basically it turned out to be Freddy. He had Jason's machete where he was like trying to lift up his arm, and he was basically about ready to like slaughter and kill these two teenagers. Well, basically, before you even know it, there is like Freddy Krueger's replica glove just randomly pierced through his chest and freaked everybody the fuck out. I find it to be humorous for some weird reason. I don't know why. But basically, Jason ended up stabbing Freddy's replica glove arm, pierced through his chest, and he basically was like standing there suffering in pain. Jason ended up falling into the lake, of course, because he was pretty wounded himself. And then basically Freddy ended up collapsing on his knees. Sorry, that's Abby barking if you cannot tell already. Basically, there's this Lori girl who like took Jason's machete, basically was about ready to cut off Freddy Krueger's head. And before she ended up cutting off his head completely, she was like, "Welcome to my world, bitch!" And then she ended up slicing him to pieces. No, wait, not slicing him to pieces. I don't know why I said that, but basically she just ended up chopping off his head like it was nothing but butter. And the way the blood was like spewing out of his like neck just took some entertainment out of me, to be honest. So yeah, if I had to pick one on-screen kill, definitely the ending to Freddy vs. Jason. Question number 9. What is your favorite horror franchise? I basically already explained this in my horror movie tag, but basically I like the Saw series. There's not a few like horror film series that I like other than the Saw series, but if I had to name off like a TV show series, I definitely like to name off a few. I like Penny Dreadful, I like American Horror Story, and The Walking Dead. I hope those 3 series actually counts, because I honestly can't think of anything else. Final question at number 10 is, who is your favorite horror director? Well, to name off 2 at the top of my head already, I like Rob Zombie generally as like a horror director. I kind of like how he brings horror films to life for some weird reason. And I also like Wes Craven. By the way, rest in peace, Wes Craven. You were so amazing. I liked Wes Craven's films because I loved how he brung like the creepiness factors in some of his films. Especially with like a movie like Wes Craven's New Nightmare. It was a stupid movie for some weird reason. I didn't really care for it, but the ending to that film, oh my gosh, like I've already explained this in my intro to Sinful Sundays video, but basically towards like the end there was like this part where Freddy Krueger was about ready to bite off this kid's head. That was another thing that kind of made my stomach turn, was the fact that he was about ready to bite off this kid's head. Just creeped me the fuck out. I just loved how he brought that creepiness factor into that movie. Definitely creeped me out for sure. Most definitely. The idea that it kind of reminded me of a Hansel and Gretel scene, or like the idea of like cannibalism being portrayed in that scene in particular, definitely creeped me the fuck out. I'm not gonna lie. And in terms of like Rob Zombie's films generally, I loved how he brung like the evilness that is being portrayed in his films. Like, I love how his characters are so sinful and so villainous, and I just love the fact that he kind of brings like this gore and this horror stuff to life. Does that make any sense with any of those 2 films in particular, or like the director's choice in horror films? I hope that makes sense. So it was hard for me to pick one, so I had to go with 2. So Wes Craven, Rob Zombie. Those are my 2 favorite horror film directors. So that is basically it for what I had to share on this horror. Oh my god, I'm doing it again for some reason. So that is basic. So I hope you enjoyed that horror tag. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video of what I had to share about this tag video in particular. So if you did, and you also love horror films, just be sure to sucker punch that like button down below. Comment down below as well. And if you haven't already, please do dedicate the time and effort to subscribe to my lovely channel to become a part of my army of darkness, and you will be updated with a brand new video every single Friday, as well as Sundays now. So that is that. And before I do my traditional outro to this video, My final Indiana vacation vlog should be up by next week, and that'll be the final one. Finally, it took about much more than a few hours of actually filming. It was so crazy. I think my third one took almost 2 hours worth of just a watch. It's crazy. I can't believe I actually overdid some of those scenes and kind of went overboard. So I'm kind of glad that I did weekly segments to begin with. So expect that sometime next week, and I will talk to you guys soon on Sunday and Friday. So yeah. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are awesome for sticking to the very end of this video. So have a chill week, an awesome day or night, and I will talk to you all soon in the next video. So until then, stay completely dark and so fucking brutal and awesome, my friends. So don't forget to stick up your devil horns for me like I'm doing right now. Okay, so take care. Bye for now.